Hey all, it's KR King here talking today about making interesting terrain for your homebrewed wilderness, because we sometimes forget as the players travel from point A to point B, the terrain in between is really like another character in your world. You know, if you have a majestic mountain peak that dominates the horizon, it's part of the, mythos and legends of that area. Think of Mount Fuji in Japan. It's emblematic, that country, not merely because you can see it from Tokyo, but also because of just the majestic sight of this snow-capped stratovolcano. In a similar way, you've got the Black Forest of Germany, the Pripyat marshes of Belarus and Ukraine. You've got the Great Lakes in the United States. These are geological features which help to define the culture and mythos of these areas. But terrain isn't just for flavor. There are practical considerations of terrain effects in terms of the game mechanics in an RPG setting. If you are going to cross a lake, the equivalent of a Great Lake, in the typical medieval fantasy setting of RPGs, that's going to be tough. You better have a craft that can handle the storms that might come up on this. You better be able to navigate and not get lost. And traveling across a mountain range like the Himalayas in this environment is virtually impossible unless you've got magical aids to, whether it's to fly over, to be able to handle the weather and the environment. And certain types of terrain lend themselves to getting lost. If you've ever been lost out in the woods, it is a horrible feeling. And interesting terrain offers up all sorts of possibilities for encounters and combat situations and tactics that, clear terrain or lightly wooded or farmland or whatever just doesn't offer. And of course, when you have a fantastical game, you can have fantastical terrain that doesn't conform to the laws of physics or geology, and filled with fantastical monsters that use this unusual terrain to their advantage. So when you create your map for your homebrew content, you want to think about, where am I going to put the interesting terrains? And typically, settlements are in clear areas or lightly forested along rivers or along coasts, just because you have farming and, you want to be able to, gain access to them, build roads between them. But that doesn't always have to be. It's a fantastical world. You could have, a city built over a waterfall, right? You can have settlements that are in this fantastical terrain. But of course, usually people do settle in areas where you could farm easily, defend the terrain and this, and you don't have all sorts of monsters that can just lurch out of the trees at you. But it doesn't have to be that far. So in my current campaign that I'm running, I have this area called the Badlands, which is between the settlements, major settlements of my world. And, I base this on the Badlands of South Dakota, which feature all these eroded buttes and pinnacles. It's a very dry and hostile environment. And mysteriously, there is this road carved through the Badlands done by this ancient civilization of giants called the Illyris that disappeared mysteriously like 5,000 years before. Just to see this road, the players realized the technology behind this was amazing. And then on either side, you have this very desolate, difficult terrain inhabited by monsters and bandits and who knows what. Which also brings up, if you venture off into this territory for any reason, it's very difficult to move through here. We're not just talking about like double your movement. We're talking about when you're navigating these buttes and these pinnacles and all this, one after another, and it could take you a day to go 5 miles. If the players want to or need to cross this area, they're going to need a guide, or they're going to have someone in their party, let's say a ranger or druid or somebody that can figure out not only how to get through this area, in a reasonable amount of time, find water or whatever, but also how not to get lost. There's a reason these kind of areas are called Badlands, because they are difficult, dangerous, and inhospitable. And another classic interesting terrain type that I use is the dark, dense forest. I have one in my world that I called the Dark Forest, slightly as a gag, but also because people often refer to this, these sort of impenetrable huge areas as the Dark Forest, because they invoke the dangers and threats and mysteries of a place like this. You have no settlements, you have no roads, and you have all sorts of scary monsters. Here again, the travel slows down to a crawl as the players have to hack their way through this dense vegetation, and of course this threat of getting lost. Now in the DMG, they have some guides here They have a DC based on the type of terrain, which you can mitigate. You got to make a survival check. So if you have players that maybe have some bonuses here or whatnot, oftentimes there's not much of a threat. If you do get lost, it's 1d6 hours before you can make another check. And I think part of this is, first of all, people often hand wave this anyway, getting lost. Part of this, if you look at this setup and sort of play it out, it's not that difficult if you've got someone with any kind of survival skills. And the thing is, you don't want to get into a thing every time they cross the wilderness. We get into these spirals of getting lost. If they're mapping, they have to cross it out or something. It can become a pain. But you can have interesting terrain areas where the players know in advance. If you go here, the impenetrable forest, the super dense jungle, the trackless swamp, marsh or whatever, there's a good chance you can get lost and you can stay lost. And there's another element here with this sort of interesting terrain, whether it's a dense forest, dense jungle, is the threat of being ambushed, because you have creatures living here who are adapted to this environment. And in a fantastical setting, you have sentient plants, and if they stay still, they're completely indistinguishable from other plants. And they're carnivores, they feed on things that get too close to them. So you have creatures that potentially get an attack, they're engaged the group, they're fighting in difficult terrain with things where this isn't difficult at all. It's hard to make tactical decisions. It's hard to run away if they need to or whatever. You've really got a battle here in this difficult, close quarter terrain like dense forest and jungle. And there's another aspect to interesting terrain such that it is inherently dangerous to travel through, the terrain itself. I have an area in my world called the Dismal Swamp, again, named after the famous swamp in the southeastern part of the United States. And it is impossible to travel by foot without a guide, right? The few areas of dry ground, first of all, they're few and far between, but also they're dotted with quicksand, movie-style quicksand, I might add. So you need to take a boat, but sometimes the boat, the areas of water end and you've got to go overland. And again, all sorts of creatures there. You've got the plants, you've got things like crocodiles, there's all sorts of great freshwater monsters in the various monster manuals and bestiaries. My players had to go into this swamp. They did a favor for this druid. There was a group, a village of peaceful lizard folk who were being harassed by some strange force. And so they had to take these flat boats down this river. And they got attacked by a shambling mound and some crocodiles and all sorts of things. The lizard folk that were opposed to them were shooting arrows from the jungle on either side of the swamp on either side, and they couldn't see them. And and again, I had insect swarms and all sorts of marsh swamp stuff. That is what makes this environment so interesting. It wasn't to my players. They were just like, this is a nightmare. And they knew they had to find their way back out. Because there's always the threat, if you're in a flatboat like that in a swamp, of it getting turned over, knocked over by a crocodile. If you're wearing armor or whatever, now you're in the water. It's really deadly. And then the other thing, of course, I have in the center of this Dismal Swamp is a forgotten city. What my players don't know, but if they're watching this, they might now. But, that's a classic, the forgotten Mayan temple or something that, is left in this place. And then you have interesting terrain that is impenetrable. It cannot be crossed. I have the mountains of teeth in my world, which is sort of patterned after the Himalayas, right? Mountain peaks that are so high that with the technology they have, they can't really cross. It's possible to fly over them with fly spells, but you better have an item like a broom or a carpet or something like that. And of course, there are all sorts of flying creatures that are patrolling these mountains, and here you come on your little flying broom or whatever. And beyond this range, I have the scorching desert, which, in addition to the incredible heat and thirst and potential for getting lost, I have these creatures, the sandworms, which are a la, the Dune books, which detect vibrations and come up and are just gargantuan. They can swallow you in one gulp. But there is an oasis the players have heard about that is said to contain secrets of the ancient race of giants, the Illyriths. So they're totally planning on an expedition because, of course, whatever the dangers, players cannot resist the potential super payday. They're always going for the big score. Another really interesting terrain type is something that is literally alive. I have a living forest along the great river Talus that runs through the dark forest. And literally, they're sentient forest creatures that I've homebrewed They occupy vast areas of these hexes. Now, if you go along the river, they have some vines and things, just are carnivorous, right? So you're going along the river, but the plants just look like ordinary plants. You land on them, and they will, attack you to consume you. I saw this movie. It's called The Ruins. It's about these tourists that go to this Mayan temple. It's an okay movie, but they get trapped in this Mayan temple where the vines come and start to eat inside of you, right? And this is what they do if you stop it all on the shore. Of course, you could stay on the river. I have this river Talus, which I sort of base, it's the size of the Mississippi River. So there's points in which it's miles across, especially near the sea. But it's also a boundary, right? You can't, there's no fords. And you couldn't really swim across it. Very swift current. You got to have boats. You got to be able to cross this. But it's also it's a barrier, but it's also a means of transportation. For instance, you can go through the area of the living plants if you stay out in the middle of the river. And if you do manage to walk along any river, whatever the terrain is on either side, unless of course, like I said, it's living plants, but any usual terrain, you can't get lost, right, on a river. But of course, a river attracts all sorts of creatures that come to drink and come to feed. Now, another great source of interesting terrain are islands, right? They're isolated, they're often remote. So I have a volcanic island in my world that's rumored to be the home of some legendary beast that only comes out every few hundred years or whatever. The players have heard about this. They're still not at the stage to go visit it. You can also have an island, the sort of King Kong Skull Island deal where it's shrouded in fog and it's totally isolated. No one goes there. You can have, all sorts of bizarre creatures or civilizations or whatever. I have an island that this wizard runs as his personal fiefdom and hunting grounds for anyone dumb enough to land there or be shipwrecked there. I also have this jungle island. So you have the classic, you're all surrounded by vegetation. And I have one of the oldest tropes in the book there where you have the dinosaur island, right? And it gets you a chance to have them in a place where it makes sense. It's isolated, this micro fauna type thing. And it's just a fun, way back into those old days of D&D. The old Destroy All Monsters Island. And then finally, you have fantastical terrain, right? The classic are the floating islands, the cloud cities, things like that. You can also have magic terrain, right? It's imbued with magic such that, the plants and the trees and everything are magical, have magical effects, the creatures that live there. You can have land that, because of this, is moving or grabs you, or areas in which, the magic of the players acts differently, their items act differently. And, movement here, if you get teleported to a floating island and you can't get that teleport back, you don't have access to it, or wherever you're transported there for some reason, and you don't have any kind of fly spells or anything, how are you going to get off this island? You're going to have to figure it out. If you wander into magically imbued terrain, is there an easy way out? Does it have some kind of barrier that prevents you from leaving? Again, once you've got magic, once the terrain itself is imbued with this, all bets are off. And what sort of creatures live in this place, and how has this magic influence, affected them? Does it begin to affect the players? Because here's the thing, interesting terrain opens up all sorts of complications and opportunities. Oftentimes we're in such a hurry, we're going to go from point A to B and I want the players to get there. We don't think about, well, what is this terrain they're crossing? Or when we set up our world, what kind of areas can I create that are difficult to travel through or have all sorts of complications? But you know what? Those areas haven't been explored. Because they're probably full of treasure, the players realize, hey, we could be the first one to go to this place. What is beyond the scorching desert in my world? The players have no idea. There's all sorts of legends. There's all sorts of rumors. That's where the Illyrith actually went. Or there's fabulous things, but they don't know. They're determined to figure out a way to get across it. Because that ultimately is what makes this terrain so interesting. The promise of something new, something unexplored, something powerful. And this is why the players are in this world. They want to discover things, they want to explore. And interesting terrain is the most interesting to explore. So I'd love to hear from you guys how you've incorporated interesting terrain into your world. Love to hear your comments. If you like my channel, of course, please subscribe. Most importantly, keep playing an RPG game. Whichever one you choose, tell somebody else about it.